Today we're going to talk about the media. The media plays an important part of democracy because it transmits information, right? Yeah, but how important is it? Well, we'll talk about it. People generally learn about politics because of the news media. The news media provides information and covers important events. Newspapers, have you read one? Television, kinda. Radio, maybe. The internet, totally. Social media, absolutely. These things have changed so radically over the course of the last 20 years that the media is kind of this big inclusive idea that doesn't really have a core in the way it used to. So the way that we get information and process information has totally changed. So initially, the revolution was crucial that we had pamphlets of information. We had the rise of the daily press. We had the Bill of Rights that protected free speech and a free press. The problem was, forever, the media has been biased. Well, how does that work? Well, somebody has to own a newspaper. Who owns a newspaper? Somebody who has wealthy interests, right? And they also get to choose stories that are important. The media has always been biased. So this is not a new thing. What is new is that it's become really, really easy to produce information, to transmit information, and to influence politics. So, historically what we had was small local newspapers. They might share stories that were of big national importance, but really everything was pretty local. We started doing investigations. Well, some rule changes in the federal government made it easier for the press to consolidate, and so one owner might own multiple media outlets in different cities and share information across those areas. Well, then what happened after that, with the telegraph, we had all these other really, really important technologies that transmitted information, but that started to consolidate the mass media. The same thing happened with television and with radio, and we had investigative journalism digging into hardcore stories, but people's attention spans were pretty short. So we had radio into everybody's home. There's an early dominance of television, CNN, cable news, Fox News. There's all sorts of this growth of media over time. But the problem is that the internet kind of broke the status quo. And all of these different outlets like radio, television, newspapers, they've really shifted to online types of material. And it's changed the way that we produce and consume media information. Social media has greatly facilitated that. So for example, I'm of the age that I'm a Facebooker, but I also have a Twitter feed sometimes, if I remember, and I have an Instagram, and my wife has a Snapchat, and who knows, there's all sorts of different things. But on my Facebook feed, I get stories that are produced by The New Yorker, that are produced by KPCC, which is our local NPR station. I get some Fox News, I get the Drudge Report. There's all sorts of different things that are showing up in my feed, but you and I both know that the stuff that shows up in our feed is curated for us. People look at our data, what we've looked at, what we've liked, and they send us things that they think we'll click on. And we click on them, that sends ad revenue back to those media outlets. So media isn't biased in the sort of way that we think about it, but even Facebook and social media are sending us things that help support our previous positions and help encourage us to think about things in a similar way. You'd think that this was like a great democracy of information, but someone has to curate that content, someone has to choose which stories are important, and we have to believe the facts that are in that story. The rise of the Arab Spring, there were all sorts of different ways in which people were communicating, and we could look through the Twitter feeds, we could look through all these social media posts, and citizens have become journalists, but they've also grown in different ways, and the quality of content that we get could be really messed up. So I have a post that shows up from one of my friends that says, somebody said this thing. Well, is it true? Is it not true? Well, the mass media before, when we had television, when we had radio, they could curate that content, they could verify it, there was some level of trust. Whereas social media now, it's really unclear the quality of content that you're going to get. We can look through all these different things, the way that we've adopted different communication technologies. One generally becomes dominant. Anyway, Government rules and regulations have tried to figure out how to control this content without violating free speech laws. So, for example, we have rules about media ownership. We have rules about equal time. We have rules about fairness. We have all these different rules to try and make sure that media is true. But what do we do about something like the Colbert Report, or the Daily News, or the Daily Show, or late night talk show? There's this infotainment where we get information and it's important, but it's also entertainment. Is that entertainment, or is it information? Is it news? So trying to regulate that is really difficult. Some of these things we call soft news, like general stories. This might be interesting to you, but it's going to increase our knowledge slightly, but it also might increase our cynicism and trust. We read about that in the book. It's pretty great. There's always bias, lots of critique about that. We have a number of ways. Like I talked about ownership. Ownership is important because it filters out what media can be, or what information can be sent on different media. What we also have is journalistic bias, how stories are written, how they're told, but most importantly, what stories are told. Regardless of how that story is bent, that is what we call agenda setting. If a story shows up and it becomes important, whether or not it's a pro or a con story, if that story shows up in the agenda, in the political agenda, that's where media has a massive role. You can look through all this stuff about horse race coverage and political scandals and how we have bias in coverage based on news beats. All those things are really, really important, but I don't want to cover those here. They are important. There's all sorts of rules that we've tried to encourage media to have licenses, to be valid. But even now, let's talk honestly about it. There are very few media owners, mass media owners. They generally can control content. Journalists tend to push the limits, and they have some discussions with their bosses about what's okay to publish and what's not okay to publish. Social media is pushing some of that away, but that also tries to push this boundary of what's free and what's not free speech. Advertising dollars matter because that's what drives revenue inside their organization. So if they start sharing stories and information that's driving readers, they'll also be inclined to share things that may play to their base, you might say. So CNN might play more liberal stories and Fox might play more conservative stories because that generates more engagement, and more engagement means more screen time for that individual watching that thing, which means more advertising dollars, and more advertising brings more revenue. And so we get this constant cycle of producing media that doesn't change opinions, it reinforces opinions. So there's all these rules, like the equal time rule about giving equal time to different political opponents. But actually what it might have done is actually discourage media outlets from covering individuals. There's issues of net neutrality, which things show up through the internet at what speeds. There's the idea of fairness and how things are covered. Scholars have looked at all of these different things. We know that the media can shape knowledge and preferences. There's some worry about the current consensus is that the biggest things that media can do is frame an issue, which is essentially telling us how to think about an issue, not what we should think, but how to think about the issue. Like, for example, is rampant drug use a problem of overprescription? Is it a problem of deviance or criminal behavior, or is it a problem of social anxiety or a medical problem? There are all sorts of these different ways. How we think about that issue will also frame how we will solve that issue. And the media plays a big role in the stories that they tell on how we think about issues. Now, priming is that the media helps us get ready for certain ideas. They push the boundaries of what's acceptable and teach us what issues should be important. And then agenda setting is when something shows up, it rallies people by essentially sharing information or stories that will help mobilize people to do something. We know that agenda setting happens, and these things are important in modern media. We can talk more about those things, the modern view of media effects. Interestingly, and you probably see this because of where we work in Fullerton, we have some really, really well-off students. We have some really impoverished students. We have students who generally can't access the internet, can't access the internet, don't have a computer at home, do have a computer at home, a printer, not a printer. The digital divide, or in other words, the disparity between those who have and those who have not, is really, really important when it comes to media. And in Southern California, for example, almost all of my students have a cell phone. They almost all can access the internet. But in rural America, where cell service is bad, or impoverished areas where internet connections aren't very stable, the poor don't have access to the same sort of media information that the rest of us do. So they get their information from a different place. This becomes really problematic because they also vote. Just because they're not from Southern California doesn't mean they're not important. In fact, they're totally important. They're equally important because they're equally citizens. So because there are certain groups that lack access, we have information filtering in different ways, and that sort of begs this question of equality, especially as we move more to the internet. Okay, just as a recap, we know that media is biased. Okay, so what? It's not necessarily always biased based on how they tell the stories, but what stories show up in the news, in the media. The book covers all sorts of these different effects, but most importantly, it's important to know that media affects the way that we interact with government because it filters out what is an important issue to us and tells us how to think. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't search for other things. We do search for other things. Media reinforces our current bias, but it does not simply expand our information, our access to information in the same way we think about it. We think about media historically as being like this wide, eye-opening issues and helping us understand the world and sharing diverse perspectives. Some media might do that, but generally it reinforces our own beliefs. I don't think that media is bad. Media has its role, but the way in which we pursue media and we consume media really, really matters.